Very good. We've got the go-ahead. Is the microphone on? People at the back, put your hand up if you can hear me. Thank you. Very good. Okay. So good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for joining us here. Today we're going to be having a discussion about after COP23, where next for the international climate negotiations. And we've got a first-rate panel here to discuss the issues. This event is being webcast live out there, and we have a very intelligent-looking audience here in front of us, so we're looking forward to a good discussion. Before I introduce the speakers, I'm just going to outline the schedule of events. So the speakers are going to each do give a few introductory remarks, and then we'll go to a Q&A section. We're going to aim to finish at about 25 past 11, because I've been instructed that we need to clear the room fairly rapidly afterwards, so that politely asking you to quickly leave once we finish the event. So I'm going to move on to the panel. We're delighted to be able to welcome Erik Solheim, the Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Programme, who is luckily in London here today and can join us for this event. He was elected to the role of Executive Director at UNEP in May 2016. Prior to joining UNEP, he was chair of the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD. And before that, between 2007 and 2012, he was Minister of the Environment and International Development, having been Minister for International Development between 2005 and 2007. He's also been a peace negotiator and helped to bring about the conflict in Sri Lanka. On
resolution of the conflict.
Sorry, resolution.
What
did I say? Sorry, my apology. I meant to say the end of the conflict. Yeah, so,
I was not fully to be blamed for the conflict.
Okay. To Erik's right is Professor Lord Nicholas Stern. He's chair of the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and Environment and the ESRC Centre for Climate Change Economics and Policy, and Professor of Economics and Government, or Ajit Patel, Professor of Economics and Government here at LSE. Prior to coming to LSE in 2007, he was at the Treasury, Her Majesty's Treasury, where he was head of the Government Economic Service and second permanent secretary, where he also undertook the landmark review of the economics of climate change. He's also been vice president and chief economist in the World Bank, and more recently, he was president of the British Academy. And on Erik's left is Archie Young, who we are especially lucky to have here so soon after Bonn finished. He's head of international negotiations, EU and carbon markets, and head of the UK delegation at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, based within the UK Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And it's a role he's had since summer 2016. His previous roles have included Deputy Director of Americas and Head of South America Department in the Foreign Office, Head of DEC Delivery Unit, and Deputy Director for Business, Environment and Olympics in the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit. So we're very lucky to have such a high-quality panel here today. I'm going to start by inviting Erik Solheim to speak for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll then have Nick and then Archie, and then we'll throw it open for questions. So without further ado, Erik?
Thank you so much. Spending so many years in politics, it's very hard to be seated and talk at the same time, so excuse me for standing up. Can you all hear me? All good. In 2004, in the spring of 2004, a small island, a little west of here, called Ireland, made a very brave decision. They decided to prohibit smoking in restaurants. It was the first nation in the world who made that move. I know it very well because we were second in Norway a few months after Ireland. At the time, the entire brewery business, all restaurants in Ireland said we would go broke if this happened. In Norway, we had intellectuals making, like Nick, making brilliant articles in newspapers saying that if this happens, the entire population of Norway will be so lonely. No one will have friends anymore, because how can they get friends if they cannot go out smoking? That is only 13 years back. Now, we have exactly the opposite difficulty, to find the one restaurant on the entire planet where you are allowed to smoke is indeed difficult. It may be somewhere in the bushes of Serbia or somewhere, for sure, but it's a really, really hard task to find that restaurant. And that enormous change has happened within 13 years, which of course from the historical point of view, an enormously short period of time. And when I go around the world, I never see smoking in government offices or among top leaders of business or wherever it may happen. So it's a complete turnaround in such a short time. That's of course exactly the same turnaround that we need to see happen on climate. Is it more difficult on climate than on smoking? Probably yes, because it's a more all-encompassing issue, bigger, including technology change, including major changes in business. However, maybe smoking was at least as difficult when it comes to behavioral change, because the enormous behavioral change which has happened in such a short time is indeed remarkable. At the time, it was a minority supporting this, even in Ireland and Norway. In Norway, it happened just because we had one brave, surprisingly conservative minister who did it even when the majority of the government were opposed, and even we other people on the left of politics were also a bit reluctant to support it because we felt the voters may not support this. So brave politicians did it, and it had completely transformed the world. So on climate, let me give you a quote which to me is very interesting. It's the Italian socialist Gramsci. He was sitting imprisoned by Mussolini during fascism in Italy in the 1930s, and he spoke about the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the will. Let's start with the pessimism of the intellect. I mean, we all know the facts. This year, nature has fought back. Huge cyclones in the Caribbean, some of the biggest in human memory, in Texas, killing people in Houston, killing people in Florida, huge droughts in Somalia. 1 million people have been forced into the cities of Somalia over the last very, very short period of time, to some extent by war, but mainly because of climate change and enormously dry situation. Big landslides in West Africa, enormous flooding in India and Bangladesh, any number of exactly what we expect to happen, severe, difficult, violent weather events. And the report we have made from UN Environment, setting the path for the future, if we continue with business as usual on what we have agreed to do in Paris and what we are on track to do at the moment, we are on the way to about 3 degrees global warming in this century, with absolutely unpredictable, but still predictable. I mean, we cannot predict every event, but we can predict direction, sea level rise, melting down on the Arctic, much more violent weather events basically all over the planet, and nature fighting back against humans, mainly through water. We tend to focus on temperature, but it's mainly about water, because people are not normally dying just because of 1 or 2 or 3 degrees warmer weather, even if that can be bad, but because of cyclones, because of high weather events, because of droughts, etc., etc. So in this sense, there is a certain level of pessimism needed from the circumstances, from the facts, from the intellect. But then comes the power of the will and what we are able to do. Mahatma Gandhi once said that the difference between what humans actually do and what we are able to do is always sufficient to solve all big problems. And for sure, it is in this case. But let then bring you around to the good news, which is the power of the will. Starting with where we see the biggest good news at the moment, that's in China. You may have followed the 19th Party Conference of the Chinese Communist Party, which ended 2 weeks back. President Xi Jinping spoke more about environment than any leader in 3,000 years of Chinese history. and indeed more than basically any leader in the rest of the world, including Theresa May or Chancellor Merkel or any good leader in Europe. So there's a huge shift in China. And when that shift happens at the top level also of the party and the state, it has huge implications everywhere because the entire system is changing. The last coal-fired power plant was just closed down in Beijing. 2 weeks back, they opened a new metro in the northern city of Tangshan, fully powered by hydrogen. Last week, they introduced the first biggest new electrical ferry in the southern city of Guangzhou. I can give you any number of facts. 70%, 60 to 70% of all high-speed rails in the world are now in China. When I first time visited China, there was one metro line in the entire continent of China under the Tiananmen Square in Beijing. Even as late as 2002, there were only 2 Chinese cities with metros, Beijing and Shanghai, both of them having 2 metro lines each. Now, Beijing and Shanghai are by far the 2 biggest metro systems in the world when it comes to passengers, and there are more than 30 cities in China with metro lines. And China is now spearheading the global bike-sharing revolution. Mobike, Ofo, they are the 2 biggest companies. You just pick up your phone, go down in the streets of Shanghai or Beijing or any street, you open the bike with your phone, you go to your grandmother or to London School of Economics or wherever you want to go buy that bike. You leave the bike, go, and then in the afternoon you pick another bike through the GPS system and go back home. There are 2 million shared bikes only in Beijing, and it's happened just in 2 years. Mobile company was valued to $40,000 2 years back. Now it's valued to $3 billion just because it has answered a demand from society for sharing bikes. I could go on and go on with all this, but when the Chinese Communist Party and the state has defined 3 main issues for China to resolve in the next 5 years, removing absolute poverty once and for all, and they're very close to doing that, financial stability to cater for economic growth, and fighting pollution, it has enormous significance. And it will be also hugely positive for the rest of the world. It will resolve problems in China, but because the market in China is so big that it brings down the price for nearly any technology and makes it available for the rest of the world. Moving on to India, Prime Minister Modi has completely, in my view, transformed the debate in India. Up to very recent, it was just one debate. We are poor. Do we want to develop, or do we want to take care of the environment? And then surprise, surprise, everyone, 99% said we need to develop first. We will do it like the Americans and the Brits and the Norwegians. First we develop, and when we are rich, we'll take care of the environment. That debate is completely transformed. Now it's one debate, how to develop, but do it based on solar energy, on wind energy, on how to move into climate-smart agriculture, how to electrify the villages. There are still hundreds of millions of Indians not connected to the grid, but how to do it not by coal, but how to do it by wind, solar, etc. And any number of planned coal-fired plants are put into the shelves in these new developments. If you go to the southern Indian state of Andhra Pradesh, probably have the highest economic growth on the planet at 11%, not building new coal plants, building solar, going into wind, contemplating climate-smart agriculture, doing tree planting, but still bringing people out of poverty at a speed which is only the Chinese has done recently. And remind yourself that China and India together is close to 40% of humanity, 37%. If you add Indonesia, it's 40% of humanity. So we cannot consider these just 2 nations in the world, like say Norway and Cameroon. These are enormously important for the entire world. And only these 2 leaders, President Xi and Prime Minister Modi, has made such a shift in these 2 nations. Then moving on to Europe, it's a fantastically good initiative these guys made at the Climate COP in Bonn. The United Kingdom and Canada spearheading an alliance to get rid of coal. True, some people argue it's easier for you because you have already done it. It's more difficult for the United States and China. But still, it's setting a tone for the market, setting a direction for the world. Very soon now 20 nations have joined this alliance. Very soon I'm sure many, many more will do it. And remind yourself, this nation where we're sitting now was founded on coal. When intellectuals are contemplating why did the Industrial Revolution happen in the United Kingdom, one of the main explanations is there was coal everywhere and there were waterways to move the coal around. There are other explanations, but at least that's one of the core explanations. For 200 years, the United Kingdom was about coal. Now coal is gone. You can do 100% of your energy without coal. Sets an example for the world. It's important by itself, and it shows an enormous positive direction, which we all need to walk. So thank you for that initiative. I think it was a brilliant initiative by you and Canada and others.
Can't take all the credit, but thank you.
Not even President Xi can take all credit for everything in China alone. You need a movement, you need a lot of people. But thank you to you, thank you to your minister, thank you to Theresa May, thank you to all who contributed to this. Move then on to the United States of America. There is one question I get wherever I go, whether it's in China, Cambodia, Congo, United Kingdom, wherever I go, it's just one question. It is very simple. It reads, what about Donald Trump? And the answer to that is it's much less significant than anyone thought. Why is that? Because now every single other nation on planet Earth, now Syria and Nicaragua just joined, so it's just one nation which is outside the Paris Agreement. Everyone else is in. And remind yourself, some of those who you could have thought would be using this as an excuse to go out have not done it. Prime Minister Modi of India, day after President Trump made this, said it would be a crime against the future generations if you don't act on climate and don't act now. Cannot be a stronger message. I just visited Saudi Arabia, a nation founded on oil, as you are founded on coal. But everyone you spoke to, Riyadh Business Chamber, ministers, all of them, fully understanding that Saudi Arabia need to change. Cannot just hunker down on one foot. They need to walk on two, and the other is renewables, solar, others, and they will invest heavily in that. And you can go around, Putin, Russia, also a potential ally on a negative climate trajectory. Again, very firmly agreeing with the rest of the world to move ahead. So every other nation move, maybe even quite a few of them more energized because of what happened in the United States. But then turn to the United States itself. Huge, strong leadership from many of the states. And people don't understand how important that is. California in itself is between the 5th and the 10th economy in the world. No company in the world, and particularly no company in the United States of America, can avoid being in the California market. If California sets standards for car emissions, is it likely that General Motors will make one car for California and another car for Alabama? Or is it likely that the California market will trump it and the same car will be used also in Alabama or Tennessee? If an insurance company is taught by California to expose its climate risks, which they for sure will be, that insurance company cannot just do that in California, because it will have to put its entire portfolio visible in California, which includes what it does in Florida or Louisiana. So the powers of states are immense. Add then power of the private sector. Every single big company in the new economy of the United States, Microsoft came to Bonn with important pledges, Apple, Amazon, you name them all, they are on the track to a greener future. I think the CEO of Walmart was probably the person putting it clearest. He was asked exactly the same question, what about the White House? Then he said, but hi, we are not Republicans, nor are we Democrats. We do this because it's beneficial for the future of the United States and our customers. We do it for future generations. But at the end of the day, we do it for ourselves. Because this is sound economy for Walmart to put solar panels on our shops to generate energy from that. So when we add all these factors, huge developments in China, huge development in India, good news from Europe, good news from private sector and many other actors in the United States, it comes up to a movement of the political will, which will win in the long term. We are on the right track. It's just a matter of the speed. We need to speed up, we need to move faster than we are, but the change has happened. And the main factor, I will close down now, the main factor of this change is price. It's not the environment, the intentions of the good people around the table here. 3 years back, coal was substantially cheaper than solar and wind. And even though everyone knows that coal is bad for health, bad for environment, dirty, still people felt, well, it creates some jobs and it's much cheaper way to development. That discussion is now closed. Everywhere on the planet, solar and wind can compete with coal on price. Add, of course, the enormous health benefits, the enormous environment benefits, the enormous climate benefits, but just on price. And in all likelihood, that the direction will continue, which will make this change very, very fast. I open up with the island example of how fast change can happen. This is an iPhone. The first iPhone was shown to the world exactly 10 years and a half back. It was in January 2007. Steve Jobs did hold up an iPhone in California. No one had seen it before. Some like Nokia didn't believe in it and are now redundant. But it's now the entire global middle class has an iPhone or a Samsung or a Chinese, but they have a smartphone. Very soon, basically everyone will have it. I mean, basically everyone on the planet now have a mobile phone, and the entire middle class has a smartphone. So change can happen very fast. We need 3 forces to come together for that to happen. Powers of citizens like you, intellectuals, but other citizens really pushing politicians and business for change. Second, the innovative spirit and fantastic ability of business to find new business opportunities, and the more an environment problem can be framed as a business opportunity, the more likely it is to happen. And thirdly, political leaderships, setting a vision, regulating markets, and forcing in the right direction. And I'm optimistic that we can bring this together, citizens, business, and politics, and then the politics of the will, the optimism of the will triumph over the pessimism of the intellect. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric, for setting in context very clearly and in an uplifting way. We'll see how uplifting we feel after Archie's account of the COP. Those of you who are paying attention may have noticed that I have cunningly failed to tell you who I am. I'm Bob Ward. I'm the Policy and Communications Director of the Grantham Research Institute. We're now going to move on to Nick Stern, who's going to talk about some of the activities that were going on around the official negotiations in Bonn.
Well, I try to follow Eric's example in many ways, so I will stand up. And thank you, Eric, for the extraordinary leadership over a very long time, both from Norway and through the UN system. I think it's fair to say that whilst the UK has done very well in these areas, really very well in terms of cutting its own emissions and growing and international leadership and development aid, relative to the number of people in GDP, I think Norway has done even better. But they're up there in the top 2 or 3. Archie, you can never go at that. But those 2 countries have actually led the charge in so many ways. So thank you, Eric, and thank you personally for what you have done, and thank you for being with us. You reminded me very much in the way you framed it through Ireland and smoking and Gramsci and so on, of the wonderful Rudy Dornbush, who, those of you who study economics seriously will know he was one of the world's outstanding macro international economists, a great international spirit and person. And he said things happen more slowly than you thought they would, and then they happen faster than you thought they could. And those of you who've done a bit of macro will know about tipping points and places where they accelerate and so on. And I think it's very important to remember that. I'm extremely optimistic about what we can do. I'm a bit more cautious about what we will do, but our job, as Eric says, is to turn what we can do into what we will do. But the political will is hard, it's changing, but we've got lots more work to do. Now, I'll talk about 4 subjects which are about delivery. I've worked for much of my life, well over 40 years in India, and my Indian friends have a very good way of putting the question, what to do? Now that's not the what to do, which is, oh goodness, there's nothing we can do. It's what to do in the more purposive sense. And I'm going to talk about investment policies, cooperation and finance. And I'll have to speak quickly because I want to do it in 10 minutes. Let me start with 4 things which I felt are growing in acceptance as overarching parts of our understanding. The first is that the 2015 global agenda of the Sustainable Development Goals and the agreed in September in New York and the climate agreement COP21 in Paris of December that year are part and parcel of the same thing. Development and sustainability and climate all come together, and we have to see it that way. And as Eric described, we increasingly are seeing it that way. This is a development story. It's a sustainable, inclusive development story across all the dimensions of development. The second key thing, which I don't think people understand well enough, but it's coming, is the urgency and the scale. The world economy will double at a 3% growth rate in a little over 20 years. Doesn't matter if it's 18 or 28, but for the point of view of the issue I'm trying to raise. Infrastructure will more than double in the next 20 years. Are we going to build that new world economy and that more than doubling of the infrastructure in the next 20 years looking anything like what we see now or not? If it's anything like what we see now, say goodbye to 3 degrees. On the other hand, if we change quickly and build that new infrastructure in a sustainable way, then we really can do this. But it needs action now. The infrastructure being built over the next 20 years is being considered and designed now. And a big part of this story is in emerging markets and developing countries. Probably 70% of that infrastructure will be built in emerging market countries, particularly in Asia. So in that sense, the future sustainability of the world lies in the infrastructure which Asia will build over the next 20 years. And Eric described how fast some of that could appear, particularly in China, of course, which is the biggest of all these cases. I'll refer to China too, where I've been working for 30 years now, and the change in the last few years has been quite remarkable. So first, the integration of climate and sustainable development. Second, the urgency and the scale. The third is that this is really the growth story. Now, over the next, as the great man of planet Earth and the blue planet, David Attenborough, said, the only people who think that we can grow indefinitely are idiots or economists. I'm not talking about indefinite growth. I'm talking about what we do over the next 2 or 3 decades. That is decisive on our future, and that's where we have to look. And in that period, we really can and should combine sustainable growth and emissions reduction. And indeed, it's not that somehow we can put them together, it's that by putting them together, we actually grow. This infrastructure investment story boosts demand in the medium and shorter term and sharpens up supply. It unleashes a Schumpeterian story of innovation, growth, investment in the medium term, and we know that there is no long-term high-carbon growth story. Creates an environment so hostile that it cuts it off. So I think increasingly people are understanding that this is the growth story. That argument is not yet won, but we're winning and we have to keep at it. And we keep at it not just by putting the intellectual arguments as we did in the New Climate Economy report of 2014, better growth, better climate, but now increasingly the example itself. And the UK has grown since 1990 by about 2/3 and cut its emissions by about 1/3. It's not a bad performance. It needs to accelerate, of course, if we're to meet our climate objectives. So it is the growth story, but finally people are seeing much more clearly the story of growth, but they're also seeing the challenges and the difficulties. Decarbonising outside the power sector is hard. We can see it in transport on the back of electricity, but we need to invest very strongly to do that, including, of course, in expanding the electricity at zero carbon. There are other sectors where it's more difficult, steel and cement and so on. Lots of technical progress and creativity there. Energy efficiency, enormously important, indeed resource efficiency in general, very important. But there are some tough areas, and we've got to have some major negatives. Zero net means zero net. So if there's a positive anywhere, there's got to be a negative somewhere else, and we've got to do it in 50 years. 50 years from now, roughly. So that is a major challenge. So as we tell the optimistic story, we have to face in a direct and clear way those very difficult areas, and going negative in major parts, and those things like cement, steel, petrochemicals and so on, which are much more difficult to decarbonise. Not being negative or not being, as it were, dismissive there, because people are making lots of progress in these areas, but they're hard. And there was a recognition too, I think, of those difficulties. So those four overarching understandings. So let me talk about investment policies, cooperation and finance very quickly. I've already emphasised scale and urgency, and that was my most important point about investment. In the biggest story of all is infrastructure in Asia that will shape what we're able to do, but investment right across the board, including, of course, in our own rich countries, where we bear not only a major responsibility for history, but a major responsibility for building and sharing new technologies. The advance of solar is quite phenomenal. Just last week, the auction in Mexico realized 1.7 cents per kilowatt hour. 1.77 cents per kilowatt hour for solar. We're used to 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. It is just amazing how fast it's come, and they're pushing on towards 1 cent per kilowatt hour. Western China, which is in desperate need of development from the point of view of the balance of China, could produce all the electricity that China needs, and it can be transported very cheaply now over to the East Coast, where most of the activity is. That is enormously encouraging, but I've already said that there are difficult areas and so on, but the advance is quite phenomenal. The challenge then in investment is to translate those new advances into reality. What do we need to do that? Well, we need the policies. How does that investment come about? It comes about because there are clear policies in which those who are making the investment can see some steadiness and reliability of returns. Those policies have to be right. It's not just the carbon price or the carbon regulation. We always start there, and correctly so, and Joe Stiglitz and I led a commission in May, which we reported in May, which described what kind of carbon prices, with the right kind of other policies, could deliver on the Paris Agreement. But those other policies are very important. Research and development, fundamentally important. Networks are fundamentally important. Public transport, recycling, reusing, combined heat and power, grids, broadband. All these things require public policy, not public ownership necessarily, but they require public policy to work. It's a basic story of networking. How many economists here? You should have done better than that. Well, well done, those who are. But the networks are about interactions between people in a fundamental way that simple market structures, which are anonymous, as it were, as between people, can't handle. So networks is a third reason. Capital markets, fundamental here in their handling of risk, and we know that there are real problems in those areas. Fifthly, information of fundamental importance, and of course what we call charmingly co-benefits, in other words, trying not to kill people through poisoning them through air pollution, is the sixth. So those are 6 big market failures. Policy has to go right across the board. You don't redesign cities through a carbon price. It has to be more than that. If you like, a city is a huge network that needs designing. But you need all those things together. So the policies have to be right, and they have to be steady and credible. So that's the kind of policy story. That's externalities and carbon policy in 3 minutes or 2 minutes. And cooperation. There it seems to me that people are working out how to do it by exchanging ideas. We have the the climate action peer exchange, lots of examples of people sharing ideas in Bonn, which I think were extremely important, and I think exemplifying the spirit of the age. You share ideas through the UN and through UNEP and UNDP. You share ideas through the multilateral institutions, financial institutions, which are actually doing quite well in this area in promoting exchange of ideas and promoting very good examples. EBRD, just 4 stops up the Central Line right here in London, is a major example of very strong and clear activity there. So there are a number of ways in which people are starting to cooperate on a major scale. The Indonesia reached out to us, and I'll be working at COP, and I'll be working with Indonesia on their new, for the first time, their new development plan. Both the perspective plan of 20-25 years and the 5-year plan will be focused on low carbon. And they reach out for direct advice and collaboration from DFID, from us at LSE, from the World Bank and other places. So cooperation around something that they themselves have decided that they want to do. China has reached out explicitly now, and we've begun a series of meetings around how China's leadership in this area can move forward. We had the first one in Bonn. There'll be another one in the China Development Forum, which is in March every year, and will proceed. I'm off to India tomorrow to speak at the Carbon Finance in Asia Forum, drawn together by the IFC, but in which the Indian government is playing a very strong role. The countries themselves, as it should be, are deciding what they want to do and choosing to whom they go for help. That's a very important part of the whole collaboration story. And as Eric said, if you put Indonesia, China, and India together, you've got a very big fraction of the world. It always reminds me of the famous Enver Hoxha. Do you remember Enver Hoxha, the president of Albania, who they'd sort of fallen out with the Soviet bloc, but they had an alliance with China, and he said, you know, if you put Albania and China together, you've got about 15% of mankind. He wasn't so funny in other ways, but anyway, the United States, well, you know, Eric noted the United States. United States is a gloriously diverse place, and there are all sorts of things happening. But actually the world has passed the Trump test. I was there in Morocco, and Bob and many of you, Eric, many of you, Archie, many of you were there, and the Trump test was passed in the sense that he'd just been elected, and everybody stood up and said, look, we just get on with it. We get on with it because it's the right thing to do, and it's the right way to grow. And we will, and they are. And the same is true of the states, cities, firms in the United States. The fact that he's drawn back is not a happy event, but we can get over it, and we are as a world. On finance, I've really said, I must stop now before Bob stops me, but on finance, the challenge is to bring down the cost of capital and share risk. And we're starting to see how to do that, particularly in the early stages of infrastructure investment. And that means, of course, having the right policies, that brings down the cost of capital and steady reduces risk. But bringing together equity, long-term finance, political risk guarantees, bringing those together, particularly through multilateral development banks, which are well placed to do that, but working very closely with the private sector. If you do that well, get over the early stages, then the infrastructure becomes a much more steady money producer, and then the big walls of private sector money on the institutional side can come in. So bringing down the cost of capital, fundamentally important here, because so much of this, if you're talking, for example, about renewable power, is capital cost up front, and then the wind and the sunshine comes for free. So halve the cost of capital, you come close to halving the cost of these things. Just as good as technological change. Put them together and you get very big effects. So as I said, I'm really optimistic now about what we can do. It's our job to actually help create the political will. It won't be easy. It's actually going to be very hard. And I do worry very much about whether we're capable of acting as fast as we need to. There are big question marks there. But the only way to tackle them is to get on with it and to make the case and give the examples. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick, for outlining some of the major trends that are going on and provided the kind of input into the negotiations. We're now going to move on to a gory description of the negotiations in Bonn, and over to you, Archie.
Can I just add one thing before Archie gets up, just to embarrass them a little bit? Right through this, the UK's involvement in the negotiations themselves has been quite extraordinarily strong and positive. I spoke about what the UK had done in terms of the 2/3 growth and the 1/3 reduction in emissions, and Eric spoke about the leadership on coal and so on. But leadership in the negotiations themselves has long been a British skill. We're not necessarily good at so many things, but in this one we have been, and we were leading members of the High Ambition Group in Paris with Amberad, led by the magnificent Pete Betts, but also by Archie and his group. So I wanted to say thank you, Archie, for that. It's been very impressive.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you for inviting me today. And as if it wasn't daunting enough to be on a panel with such distinguished members, to then have such flattery as well to start is kind of thrown me. So this is actually really useful for me because, as Bob said, I've just spent the last 2 weeks immersed in the negotiations in Bonn. And actually just hearing Nick and Eric speak about what's happening in the real world, how the economics of climate change is changing, has kind of brought me back to life again. The negotiations finished just before dawn on Saturday morning. I have 2 very small children, so I still haven't slept since I got back. And actually, this has given me that breath of fresh air and optimism that, as Eric said, change can happen very fast. I think it needs to in the UNFCCC process if we are going to achieve what we set out to achieve by the end of next year. So I will talk a bit about the context for COP23. Then I'll say a bit about the negotiations themselves. And then I'd like to build on what Nick said about the real world action and some of the announcements that were made. And then finish on what next, where do we go? But just to test the audience, before I start preaching to the converted, could people who were here, who were actually in Bonn, please put up their hands? Okay, right. So actually a fair few people. So you can tell me if I get any of this wrong as well, I hope. So the context for COP23, the Paris Agreement was a historic achievement. It really brought everybody together. As Nick said, we now have Syria and Nicaragua who have signed up to it. 170 parties have ratified out of the 196, which means that last year it entered into force far quicker than anybody thought possible. Whilst being a historic achievement, the Paris Agreement is also quite a high-level agreement in many ways. It sets out ambitious kind of statements. It sets out a framework as to how things will work together, but it has left a lot of the detail as to the nitty-gritty nuts and bolts of how that will work still to be decided. And that is exactly what we are doing now. Somebody described some elements of the Paris Agreement as constructive ambiguity. We now have the task of deconstructing that ambiguity and turning it into an agreement that actually is fit for implementation. As an example, if you as a country have a nationally determined contribution, you need to know what the framework that sits within is, how it works, what will happen if you fail to meet what you said you would do? What support will be provided? How will that support be provided? How will you report on what you are doing? How will others do that? All of this sounds quite techy, but actually if we don't get that right, the risk is we will have a lot of empty promises and we won't have a means of knowing actually whether they were empty or whether they're being fulfilled. So with that context of the Paris Agreement, next the context of COP23. So last year in Marrakesh, we agreed that we would finalize the rulebook or Paris Agreement Implementation Programme or Work Programme by the end of 2018 at COP24 in Poland. In order to do that, we needed to use a lot of COP23 to really go through the details. So in many senses, the prospects for 23 was that it was a working COP. We would get our heads down and work through the detail. But a few things changed that. One was the series of extreme weather events, particularly the hurricanes in the Caribbean, but also elsewhere around the world, which really emphasized the urgency of climate action. The second was, as has been mentioned, the decision by President Trump to announce his intention to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. And the third was the fact that Fiji would be president of COP23, the first small island developing state to do so, hosted in Bonn in Germany, so another test for the process, a presidency and a host from different countries. But this combination of the real-world impacts, the perceived threat of one of the major countries, and the kind of moral voice of the presidency meant that actually COP23 bore far greater significance than its stepping stone in the Paris Agreement process might have foreseen. So on to what did we want to achieve from COP23? So we set out that we wanted to make genuine, tangible progress on the detail of the rulebook. That doesn't sell newspapers, it doesn't make great headlines, but actually that is absolutely necessary. A lot of that happened in dark rooms. Some of you were in those rooms, working through really understanding the different interpretations of the Paris Agreement and the implications of it. What were the implications for a small island state with limited capacity? What were the implications for a large developed state who had been doing some of these things for 20 years or more? Working through that detail, but also crucially capturing it. We really did not want to walk away from COP23 having had lots of useful conversations, but that all be left in people's heads. And that was a risk, because people in these negotiations are reluctant to see things written down, because as soon as they are written down, even in, and believe me, we have these informal non-papers, it's a fun process, that still can have a degree of salience, of importance, that makes some people nervous. So we wanted to see genuine progress and see that captured. We also wanted to see progress on a process which was previously known as the facilitative dialogue. Always makes me smile. In the UK civil service, we have a comms book which says, you know, these are the words that we should try to avoid because they are meaningless. And it includes the words facilitate and dialogue. So thankfully, our Fijian presidency came up with a far better name, which was the Talanoa dialogue, which refers to a Pacific form of having a conversation, a constructive conversation, where differences can be aired, but where there is genuine respect and a desire to reach a conclusion. Now, this is process heavy, but this Talanoa dialogue is the process whereby over the next year, countries will get together and ask themselves three questions. Where are we? Where do we want to get to? And how do we get there? So this is, if you like, the precursor to the global stocktake 5-year cycle that we will see kicking in 2023. And the expectation is that as a result of this conversation, by 2020, parties will accelerate or increase their ambition. So that is why this process is so important. That is why it was very important to us that we got a good design of that process, which was inclusive, evidence-based, which could enable both parties but also non-party stakeholders, What do I mean by that? I mean businesses, civil societies, youth groups, faith groups, whoever they might be, to contribute and really have a say in that conversation. A third thing we wanted to achieve was about upholding the integrity of the process. Sounds very grand, but actually just keeping this show on the road. The winds, the buffeted by the winds that I mentioned earlier in terms of that context. It's difficult with 196 parties reaching agreement. Some of you, I know, have been at the coalface of that. But actually, we needed to show that this process was bigger than one party and that it genuinely could do what it said it would do. The fact that at 4 a.m. we had the obligatory mass huddle with however many people all crowded round in a corner of the room, desperately arguing about the footnote to the annex to the decision. Again, I'm not joking, that was exactly how it was. Can lead some to lose faith in this process. What are we doing arguing over this when the real world, as Eric and Nick said, is changing at such pace? But actually, we need this process because this process sends the signals to the real world that enables the real world to act. And we needed to show that this process could withstand those winds of change and that we could actually move forward with what we set out to achieve. On all of those, I think we made good progress. Of course, there are elements which went faster than others, some areas which actually need to accelerate. But overall, we came out of it, I think, with all of those elements intact. In addition to that, we also came out with really quite exciting, because they've been kind of in stasis for so long, decisions on agenda action plan, which looks at how we can encourage and incentivize and build the capacity to enable a greater gender balance, both in negotiations but also in climate action. And also a platform for indigenous peoples, which should do the same to really enable their voice to be heard in this process, which, given that they are often the people who suffer most, being when their lands are devastated by climate change or taken over by farming, it's really important their voices are heard. There was an important decision on the Adaptation Fund, which was very controversial, which said that the Adaptation Fund shall serve the Paris Agreement, subject to various safeguards. This is a fund that has been kind of developed totemic status in the negotiations. It is very important to developing countries who appreciate its ease of access, its small-scale funding. There are others who say, well, actually, whilst that is maybe the direction of travel, before we say that actually something shall happen, let's work out those safeguards, the governance, etc., before it happens. But these are the nature of the negotiations. So there's a lot of work to do. I think we saw that we were able to withstand the challenges that were thrown at us. But we really do need to accelerate the action over the next year. What happened in the dark rooms in the negotiations was part of the story. I hope I've given you a sense of the gory details I think I was billed for. Believe me, there's plenty more gore, but that sounds like a reference to Al Gore. It shouldn't really. But that's maybe for a coffee afterwards. But I think what was happening there was important, but actually what happened outside the negotiating rooms was also vital. In terms of showing that this process could withstand those changes and showing that momentum continued, it was really important that we had such a series of strong announcements which demonstrated both countries and businesses and civil society really taking action on climate change. Thank you to Eric for the recognition of the UK's powering past coal announcement. So we did that with Canada, and at the event we had, I think, 28 countries and states joined us to commit to a phase out of unabated coal. It turned into one of the stories of COP, one of those moments that brought everybody together, working with the High Ambition Coalition that Nick mentioned, to really galvanize the community and set out an ambition for other parties to come behind. We also did the international launch, if you like, of our Clean Growth Strategy, which we published last month, which sets out the UK's decarbonisation plans out to 2030 and beyond. As Nick said, the UK has a strong story to tell. Since 1990, we have reduced our emissions by 42%, whilst growing our economy by 67%, which shows that with the right framework, actually you can make the really quite significant strides that need to be taken. Coal was mentioned. Another statistic for you is that in July 2012, coal made up 40% of the UK's energy mix. In July 2017, it made up 2%. So in 5 years, that's evidence of what has been said about just how fast this change can happen. We had some days this year where coal provided 0% of our energy mix. And this from a country which has built its history over the last 200 years on coal. We also announced over £300 million worth of programs to support developing countries to take climate action. This includes things like a sustainable infrastructure program, which builds on a lot of the work that Nick has done with colleagues in the New Climate Economy Report and others. We also announced that we ratified the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, which commits to the phasing down of hydrofluorocarbons. And on Friday, we deposited our instrument of ratification for the Doha Amendment to the Kyoto Protocol, which is, if you like, the second commitment period, which is how developed countries will meet their pre-2020 commitments. Those pre-2020 commitments proved to be one of the political issues of the COP, where, given the context, there was a lot of questions about, are developed countries really serious about what they said they would do before 2020? And can we trust them? And one of the things we've agreed is that over the next 2 COPs, there will be a spotlight on pre-2020 action, where, from our perspective, we will be able to set out, yes, we are meeting our commitments, but also, yes, there is far more that we all collectively need to do to tackle this challenge. So I hope I've given a sense of the context, some of the gory details of the negotiations, some of what was happening outside the negotiations as well. Over the next year, we will all be busy. We have, just in a couple of weeks, the One Planet Summit that President Macron is hosting in Paris, which will have a real focus on how finance is enabling this transition. We will have the Cities Summit in September 2018, where Governor Jerry Brown of California will bring together representatives of cities and regions and actors around the world to show what is happening at that level. We will have the year-long process of the Talanoa Dialogue, like I said. We will have the Commonwealth Summit in London in April, which will have a sustainable future as part of its themes. And we will have the negotiations continuing, both in Bonn and working through to Poland at the end of next year, where we hope to really finalize the detail of the Paris Agreement, how it will work in practice, so that we can all take our commitments, go further, go faster, and really do what we said we would do. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Archie. I can say, as somebody who's been to many of these COPs, that it's absolutely bewildering and incomprehensible trying to work out what's going on from the even when you're there, and there is no substitute for the experience that Archie brings of actually having been in the middle of the negotiation. So he provided a superb overview of the progress that happened. Absolutely. I know a lot of people can be very negative about the UNFCCC process, but remember, it's a consensus process between 196 countries. Can you imagine? It's not amazing that so little gets done. It's amazing that anything gets done at all in such a process. So, and I would repeat Nick's comment. So when I speak to people at these events, they are all uniformly talk of the great professionalism and skill of the UK's negotiating team. Then we should all, those of you who are British, should feel proud of the work that they do. I know there aren't too many reasons to feel proud of being British. So we're now going to move on quickly to the Q&A session. We're going to finish at 25 past. Because we're broadcasting live, webcasting live. I'm going to ask you to wait for, are we waiting for the microphone? Do people need to wait for the microphone? Yes, they have to wait for my microphone. So I'm going to bring the microphone. So questions particularly are welcomed. So please try and make it a question. And if you'd like to say your name and any affiliation you'd like to declare, that would also be helpful as well. So any questions? So we'll start. I'm going to hand it to Chris first, and I'm going to try and achieve a gender balance that we don't have on the panel today. That's because one of our colleagues, Alina Averchenkova, had to withdraw at the last minute. I'm going to start with Chris.
Thank you very much. Chris Bowman, EBRD. I wanted to challenge Eric and Archie on a point that Nick made about the hard problem of materials. Bonn and the Paris Agreement is based on NDCs and country commitments which work in power and automotive probably. They do not work on international materials. So Indonesia and India will be busy building conventional carbon-intensive steel industries using carbon-intensive infrastructure. Is there any suggestion of an institutional filling in for this gap in the structure to tackle this very hard question?
Go ahead.
We have very limited time, so if we will allow a few questions, maybe we should...
Okay, we'll do them in threes then. Okay, let's have a question here.
Hi, I'm Maria Carvalho from the Grantham Research Institute, and my question is really to ask about the small island states and what kind of mechanisms are there to address loss and damages.
Okay, and we'll have the last one from over this side.
Clive Ellsworth, I co-founded Citizens Climate Lobby UK, campaigning for a rising carbon price. I understood that the big breakthrough with the Paris Agreement was to allow climate clubs, rather than have to have insisting on unanimity, which pretty much guarantees the lowest ambition, and that with climate clubs you could have smaller groups of people, smaller groups of countries, who could come to more meaningful agreements. And one of the agreements which has been lacking for so long, of course, is a rising carbon price, which would address the point made here. Of course, this introduces competitiveness problems. I know Nicholas knows all about that. I've seen your lectures on it. With a small climate club of, say, of the industrialized countries, they'd be able to agree a carbon price. I thought you might say something about that wasn't mentioned at all. Is there anything to say about that, please? Thank you.
Okay.
Shall I say something about carbon price? And you know very well that Joe Stiglitz and I argued that for the achievement of the Paris Agreement temperature target well below 2 degrees, along with other policies, as I tried to describe, we should be looking for a carbon price of 40 to 80 by 2020 and 50 to 100 by 2030 dollars a ton of CO2. At the moment, close to just under 15% of emissions are covered by carbon price. With the expansion in China and Central America, California's increasing link-ups, that might rise to 25% or so. So the area of coverage is increasing. 2 weeks ago, the European Union finally got the decision to start taking out permits and pushing up the European carbon price, which, you know, they hope. Jos Delbecker of the European Union was making that case and telling the story quite strongly right through Bonn, that we hope in the European Union to get it back up to 15 or 20 dollars a ton by 2020 or so. You and I and many others will be pushing them to do better, but at least they've realized that if you give out too many permits, you crash the price. You don't have to come to the LSE to work that out, but they are moving in a better direction. But I think we will see a rising carbon price, and we will see an increase in coverage. But I think we're also going to have to see change driven by much more than that. Partly by the wonderful technical progress that we see, which is driving down costs so much. And noting and remembering that the reason that technical progress came about was because for some time now we've been pushing at policy in these areas. It didn't magic itself out of nowhere. It's a policy-driven change and an expectation of policy-driven change. So I think we're going to have to do much of it by carbon price, but probably much more of it in other ways too, including city design, infrastructure design, technical progress, fostering more R&D, and so on. In other words, the range of policies that I tried to describe. Very quickly on cement, those of you in the room should know, and steel, there's nobody around that knows more about steel than Chris Bowman, so I'm not going to sit here and tell Chris about steel. But I would in some ways turn the question back. I keep hearing about the technical progress in steel and the possibilities of on the technical front of hydrogen and so on. I don't know that story, Chris, but you hear quite a lot about that progress. But what I would feel more confident about answering on this one is the emphasis on resource efficiency. It was a very powerful theme in Bonn, the whole resource efficiency story. Depending on who you read, 40-some% of what we need to do in reducing emissions could and should come not just in energy efficiency but in resource efficiency more generally. I was on a panel on innovation in Bonn, since we're talking about Bonn, with the head of Michelin, and they had some remarkable stories, and he had the 3 R's, which were reduce, reuse, renew and recycle, and he was explaining in the car, in the tyre sector about how fast they're moving, and even had a nice video, which is a bit speculative, about 3D printing when you go into the tyre replacement shop and so on, the kind of materials it would use. So I think the whole resource use, covering steel with concrete, it doesn't help you recycle the steel, does it? But you can design so that you can reuse in a much better way. So I think we need strong technical progress on the techniques themselves, and then you can tell me about that. But I think also the whole story of what the head of Michelin called the 3 R's, the circular economy, I think there's, and within, let's use the overall word resource efficiency, that I think is a very powerful story.
Eric? Or Archie, do you want to go?
Sure. Conscious of time, so I'll try to be brief in answering the 3 questions. As Nick says, far be it from me to talk steel to you, but I think there were announcements and there is progress in terms of the investment in research and development, the possibility that is given by Mission Innovation in terms of mobilizing greater R&D investment around the world. I think there's more we can do to focus it on some of the questions like the one that you answer. Also investment in carbon capture, usage and storage for industrial use, not just for power generation. I think there are real opportunities there. On small island states and loss and damage, the work program for the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage was agreed, and that includes how that executive committee will really explore the issue of loss and damage, how it will be tackled at future COPs, also look at the match between the scale of the problem and the different range of hesitate to say solutions because it's not a solution, but range of responses. One of the things that was announced at COP was a very large program called Insure Resilience, which seeks to roll out insurance policies to people in small island developing states so that they have some form of recompense in light of extreme weather events. And also, I think there's a point about loss and damage, which is it's part of a spectrum of adaptation. And the more we can do to invest in mitigation, in adaptation, and also in providing the the response is often that's in the form of humanitarian response. I think when we see it in that broader spectrum, there's a lot that is being done on loss and damage, and obviously Fiji, as the presidency, rightly shone a spotlight on that. And then finally, clubs of countries. A lot of that, building on what Nick said on carbon pricing, there were a lot of discussions about the carbon markets and the direction of that. That's covered in the Paris Agreement under Article 6, which includes both cooperative approaches and a new kind of mechanism, as well as, oddly, non-market approaches in the same kind of heading. There was more progress on those discussions than we have seen at recent sessions, the UK is a member of one of the clubs that you referred to. We're in fact a member of a couple, so we're a member of the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, I think it is,
yes.
That met in Rome just before COP. And also we joined last year the New Zealand Declaration of Carbon Markets. And I went to an event on that just last week where we were again sharing the learning between us, sharing the stories, the best practice. How are you developing your carbon markets? Where are you on your carbon pricing? How can we take that learning, but also how can we look to the future as to whether some of these different markets might join up and interact in future? And in that, it's not just, I think, between geographic jurisdictions. I think it's also really useful to look at the different sectoral kind of spheres as well, given that under the International Civil Aviation Authority, International Civil Aviation Organization, there are ongoing negotiations about the development of a carbon market to capture emissions from the aviation sector, and how that will fit with our national and kind of plurinational market schemes, I think is a really important question.
Right.
Try to briefly add, I have no knowledge of the specific sector of steel as you may have, or cement. However, I think the broad issue is how to assist nations not locking themselves into old technologies when there is so rapid change, particularly on the energy side, but also on other sides. Because these, investment decisions on infrastructure and others are long term, and you may be there with the old technology for many, many years unless you change now. So that's the wide issue. On small island development states, as you said, Germany and some insurance companies launched a scheme in Bonn for how to insure the most difficultly insured people in the world. The more vulnerable you are, the more difficult you are to be insured for obvious reason. So let's see how that develops. There's an added issue in my view, and that is how to help the small island development states in changing their economy, because nearly all of them are middle-income countries, so they have difficulties attracting aid. At the same time, they are very vulnerable and very weak economies, so they have difficulties attracting investment. Many of them are spending enormous amount of money importing oil for their energy, while very small investment could easily turn them into solar and renewable energies. But they cannot get the aid and they cannot get the investment, so they are stuck. So even here, things like reclassifying them in the international markets, both private markets, but also with the World Bank and others, may be issues we should really contemplate, because true, many of them are middle-income countries, some of them with a GDP per capita like, say, Turkey or Mexico. But because there is not one storm which can wipe out Turkey, not one natural catastrophe which can destroy Mexico, but there are natural catastrophes which can wipe out Grenada or maybe Fiji or the Solomon Islands, etc. So that's another added element. Finally, on carbon price, sorry to use that word, but I was the facilitator of what was called markets in some of the previous conference of the parties. And the idea at the time was very simple: how to make sure that the European carbon market goes global and bring everyone into that. It took me not many hours of negotiations to understand that it was complete non-starter. We Europeans thought it would be good. Frankly, quite a few of those who did drive the UN climate work at the time also thought so, but it was a complete non-starter with the Americans, with the Chinese, with everyone else. So I came to the conclusion that only way carbon markets can evolve is from bottom up, not top down. And that's exactly what we are seeing now. It will be a Chinese carbon market. In all likelihood, it will be a North American, West Coast Canada, Mexico carbon market. And maybe the European and the Chinese and these North American and other carbon markets can at some point converge and speak to each other. Though this is slower, it's on the way forward. Finally, you point to the international aviation. That's a huge opportunity. For good and bad, if there is one industry in the world which really will develop in the next few years, is the aviation industry. Still, I don't know the numbers, but out of the 1.3 billion people in India, I'm sure not more than maybe 50 million have ever been up in the air. Even in China, the vast majority has not still been into an aircraft, even with a huge middle class in China. It will grow very, very fast. And that will generate a huge amount of money in this aviation carbon market. And I think that will particularly be a fantastic possibility to protect the global forests, because the airlines would love to put that into the airline magazines. I mean, we protected the gorilla in Korea, in Indonesia, or the fantastic beauty of the Brazilian rainforest. It sells much better, frankly, than cement factories or steel. So that we can here, if we get it right rule set, right clearing mechanism, we can have an enormous money stream to really make protection of global forests.
Thank you very much, Eric. Right, we're going to try and cram one last question in from the other side of the room before we close. So who's got a very quick question? Here, we're going to go here.
Hello. I just wanted to ask...
Say who you are.
Sorry. I'm Karishma. I'm from SOAS. I wanted to ask if in the negotiations you have considered who are going to bear the costs of the fast, rapid implementations of these environmental policies and regulations, and how to ensure that the poorest in the country do not disproportionately end up bearing the cost of these policies.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to invite the panelists to very quickly respond and give any final remarks. So,
if we do this well, your question is misplaced, because this is the growth story. This is doing things better and cheaper. I mean, decentralized. I've worked for much of my life in one village in India for the last 43 years. And decentralized solar in that place is going to be much more attractive than try to link up to a grid, you know, where people steal the wires, people come round and try to extort money from you for not switching it off. I mean, decentralized solar is one example with a way in which poor people can benefit from this whole story. This is the growth story, and it's the inclusive growth story. You need good policies to make that happen. But we're past the old UNFCCC, which says, oh, there's this extra cost of doing it, and who's going to bear that cost? That was the question in the early 1990s. And I think now people are asking, how can we put in place the kinds of policies, the kinds of investments that actually particularly benefit the poorer people?
Archie, do you want to?
Sure. Absolutely, that is exactly the right answer. But unfortunately, we're not quite yet past the point of the responsibility on developed countries to enable this transition. So we have, as developed countries, collectively committed to a goal of mobilizing $100 billion a year by 2020. And there is a commitment that we will review that again by 2025 with a new long-term goal. Last year, the UK and Australia, on behalf of all developed countries, produced a roadmap working with analysis from the OECD, which showed that we are broadly on track to meet that $100 billion goal. But a lot of that, the UK, we play our part. We have $5.8 billion of international climate finance over 5 years. But a lot of that, as Nick said, that's a drop in the ocean compared to the real world finance flows that we need to be channeling into the low carbon transition. And if we can get that, those long-term finance flows sort of aligned with the low carbon transition, then that 100 billion is essential to really help those who need it most and to fill the gaps that at the moment the private sector can't do. but it's really just one small step and part of a far bigger picture.
Archie, can I just add that an example of that is I was on a panel with Pete Betts in Bonn, just to keep this focused on Bonn, which was sustainable infrastructure in Latin America and the Caribbean, where the UK, through the BEIS, had contributed substantial sums to help foster this kind of investment. And it was the only event I went to where there was a bouncer on the door controlling the number of people who, because it was so high in demand, everybody wanted to come to this. So that's a Bonn example of this kind of process at work.
And also the GCF, sorry, Bob, but the Global Climate Fund has a private sector facility, and that estimates that with 1.2 billion of public money, that they expect to mobilize 41 billion of private sector money.
The final word to Eric.
I think this question is very right and very wrong at the same time. It's very right in the sense that there are a number of issues which can only be resolved by public money, and where the developed world will, because we have caused the problem, and we need to assist those who have not caused the problem at all. That applies to some, particularly to adaptation in some of the least developed countries. But then it's very wrong in the sense that overall there is an enormous opportunity handling climate, not an enormous risk and an enormous problem. We can get any number of jobs. There are 5 times more jobs in the United States of America in the solar industry than there is in coal. Still, a number of politicians are running around speaking as if coal is where we produce the jobs. And added, these jobs in the solar industry are much more for women, much cleaner, much more future-oriented, much more popular. I mean, where are the students in the United States want to go? You think they want to go to West Virginia to do coal, or you think they want to go to Arizona and California to do solar? So why do we confuse this as if it's an enormous problem? It's an enormous business opportunity, enormous opportunity for jobs. Added, and that's why we in the environment has put pollution front and center. There is an enormous opportunity, sorry for this non-environment phrase, to kill many birds with one stone. We can provide jobs, we can kill pollution, and we can reduce the climate risk with the same policies. It's all about the policies, but when we move from coal to solar, when we move into electrical mobility in the cities, when we move into climate smart agriculture, all these will make us more prosperous, a better life, more jobs, and solve environment and climate and health problems with the same policies. So that's the direction. Let's consider it an enormous opportunity for humanity, not a problem.
Very good. A positive note to end on. Please thank our panel, Eric Solheim, Nick Stern and Archie Young. And thank you all for your participation. And if you can leave your seats rapidly, that would help us
Very good,
greatly.
Eric.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much. Bye-bye.